Okay, so now we've seen how metabolism is defined and driven by thermodynamics and the control mechanism, the enzymes that drive all of this and control exactly what happens where. But remember, what is occurring in your body, what biochemical reactions are occurring, are really driven by thermodynamics. They're only controlled and allowed to occur by the enzymes. So I want to start putting this all together, and we're going to discover there's one last concept that we need to get a handle on before we really understand what's going on with your metabolism. And I want to take you here to study that. And you might recognize this, or you might not, I don't know. This is a weird looking place. It's got these chimney looking things with looks like black smoke coming out of it. This is not black smoke. This is water. Here we are at the bottom of the ocean. In fact, one of the deepest places in the ocean. In this particular case, it's a deep, deep trench not far from Japan, the coast of Japan. And this place right here is extremely harsh. It's a very, very harsh environment, far more deadly to you than deep space would be. If you were exposed to this environment, you would die more rapidly than you would if you were exposed to deep space. In deep space, you could live for a minute or two. This one, you'd be killed essentially instantly. And you'd be killed in a whole bunch of different ways for a lot of reasons. First of all, if you look here, you can see it just looks nice, like beautiful clear water, but that water is under incredibly high pressure. And the reason is that there is a mile of water above every square centimeter of the bottom of the ocean here. An entire mile of water. Now think about how water, its density, think about how heavy it is. If you wonder how heavy water actually is, think about this. Take a gallon of water, a milk jug full of water, and just hold it out. Just hold it straight out and hold it like that for 5 minutes. And if you do that, you'll get a very intuitive sense of actually how dense water is. Water is really heavy. And imagine a mile of it over every square centimeter of your body. Okay? Probably you can't, because the effect of that is astonishing. If you were to take a main battle tank, the kinds of tanks that we have in our arsenal right now, the M1A1 Abrams, if you were to take one of those tanks and button it up so that it is capable of withstanding a nuclear environment, a biological environment, a chemical environment, and you were to take it and put it down to the bottom of the ocean, as you're moving it down into the bottom, that tank would get smashed absolutely flat from the pressure in the water. That's how much pressure there is. And we're talking about a tank made of depleted uranium armor. I mean, this thing is about as strong as we can make things. So how is it we get down here to take this picture? Well, we have to have something that is able to withstand that kind of static energy, that kind of static pressure. And granted, the main battle tank is not really made for that. It's made for dynamic pressure. But okay, whatever. The point is that in order to get down here, we have to have extremely good engineering. And only a few vehicles are capable of getting down to a point where we can take this picture. So that's one of the problems. The problem is this pressure, this huge amount of pressure. The other problem is this. You see the water coming out here, it looks like black smoke. That water is coming out, it's about 600 degrees Celsius. Now you notice 600 degrees is way higher than the boiling point. But it's not boiling. The water's not boiling. Why is that? Why is it not boiling? Because it's under pressure. The pressure is keeping it from boiling. And if we were to go out here, right out here to this really dark colored water right here, which is nice and clear, that water, which is only about 10, 15 centimeters away from that really hot water coming out, the water here is below freezing. It's -4 degrees Celsius. Again, you might wonder, well, why is it not ice if it's below freezing? Again, the pressure. So we have within the space of about 10 to 15 centimeters a temperature gradient from 600 degrees Celsius to below freezing, below zero. So this is an extremely harsh environment for a number of reasons, and yet there's even more. If you look at the environment, you were to measure the pH, the pH of the environment here is worse than stomach acid. It's more acidic than your stomach is. So this is a really, really difficult place to survive. You would be killed, like I say, instantly if you were exposed to this environment. But look carefully. You look along these rocks and you'll see all this white stuff. In fact, you can even see these little white flecks in the picture here. Each one of those, all of that white stuff, even the flecks and the stuff on the rock, all of that is living material. That is prokaryotic stuff of a group that we call the archaeans. Now, if you look at this, then you've got living things down here. And not only that, but not just these archaeans, these prokaryotes, but also these things. You see here, this is a tube. And inside of this tube looks like there's some kind of a feather sticking off the top, this red feather looking thing. And this is not a plant. This is actually an animal. This is a worm. And what you're looking at here is not the worm, but its mouth and tongue. And it's laying in its tube. And it's like, sticking its mouth and tongue up. And it is feeding on these little flecks of prokaryotes, these little blobs of prokaryotes, land on that tongue. And the thing then has these ciliated hairs on its cells that then push all of this stuff down into its mouth, and it swallows it. And it survives, no problem. But also look around. You can see other things. There's sponges. There's mussels. There's clams. If you look around, you can't see it in this picture, but there would be fish, octopus, crabs. In fact, the crabs feed on these tube worms. What they do is they climb up these little tubes that the tube worm secretes, and they have to do it extremely carefully because as they climb up, if they jiggle the tube even the slightest amount, this tube worm is going to feel it. And so you get this crab and climbs up, climbs up, climbs up, climbs up, climbs up very carefully. It takes them an hour to get up this entire tube, and the tube is only maybe 3 feet tall. And it gets to the top of the tube, and it just gets there. And usually what happens is when it gets to the top, it's extremely difficult because the tube is very flimsy and flexible at that top. And so the slightest motion will be felt by the worm. When the worm feels that motion, it pulls that tongue and that mouth in so fast, the muscles react so fast that your eye cannot register it. It literally happens so fast that you would be looking at it and it would look like that little red plume is there and then it's suddenly gone. You can't see it move. And then right there at the end of that tube is the world's most disappointed crab. So that is a living ecosystem in this area. And the point is it's extremely harsh, much, much harsher than the ecosystem you live in, but yet there's this thriving community down here. Okay, now here's a question. How is this ecosystem fundamentally different than the ecosystem in which you live or the other ones that you may know of? Okay, well, yeah, it's under a huge amount of pressure. There's a bunch of acid. We'll see where the acid comes from shortly. And there's all these differences in temperatures and all this stuff. But that's not fundamental. What's fundamentally different has to do with the energy source. What is the energy for the living things down here? Well, what's the energy for us? Where do we get our energy from? Well, we saw this in an earlier lecture. We get our energy from food. Okay? Well, where does the food get the energy from? Well, if we trace all of our food back, if we eat a cow, we eat beef, pork, whatever, we trace it to plants, or we eat the plants directly, carrots or whatever. Everything goes back to plants. So where do the plants get their food? Plants get it from photosynthesis, as you probably know, which means the energy that you eat is coming from the sun. All of it. 100% of all the energy you've ever used in your life came from the sun. Ladies and gentlemen, you are walking, talking sunlight in a very, very real sense. But this ecosystem is fundamentally different because, in this case, there isn't any sunlight. If you look down here, you can measure that light is coming from the sun, from the surface of the earth, but the light is so sparse that it's only approximately 1 photon, 1 particle of light per square meter per second, which is useless for photosynthesis. So these are not swimming, gulping sunlight, like you were walking, talking sunlight. There's something else. There's some other source of energy that's driving this whole ecosystem. And the producers, the things that harvest that energy in our ecosystem, are the plants. So there are no plants down here. There can be no plants. There's no photosynthesis. There's no chlorophyll. There's no green anything. So the question then is, where is it that these prokaryotes, I call them bacteria here, they're really archaeans, where is it that these archaeans are getting their energy from? That's what I want to deal with right now. Okay, before we go there though, we have to take a look at one last concept, one last metabolic concept. And that has to do with these kinds of reactions. All the reactions of metabolism, or the main reactions of metabolism, have to do with energy being transferred using these types of reactions, where oxygen or hydrogen is transferred from one place to another. Those kinds of reactions are called redox reactions, reduction oxidation reactions. Okay, now if you've had chemistry, which all have supposedly had chemistry, I know that some of you might not remember it, but oxidation reduction is a very critical part of any kind of chemistry, especially organic chemistry. And what is the definition of oxidation reduction? Well, the definition is a little bit unclear when we're looking at it in actual reaction schemes. The definition of oxidation is loss of electrons, and the definition of reduction is gain of electrons. And any kind of reaction which you lose an electron, something has been oxidized, and whenever something loses an electron, something else has to gain the electron. The electron can't just disappear, and so those oxidation reduction reactions always occur simultaneously. Something gets oxidized, something gets reduced, which is why we call it redox. They always occur at the same time. Okay, but that isn't as clear as it could be for our purposes. First of all, the electron isn't what's important for us. In metabolism, what's important is the energy. The electron is carrying the energy. The energy that we get, all of the energy of our lives, comes from electrons changing energy state, not from the nucleus. We're not physical nuclear reactors, we're chemical reactors. And chemistry is all about changes in electron energy states. So when we lose electrons, we're losing the energy of the electron. So oxidation is loss of energy as well as electron, and reduction is therefore gain of energy. Now, that's how I want you to be thinking about it. Yes, know the definition, loss, gain of electrons, but also realize that when we're talking about losing and gaining electrons, we're talking about losing and gaining energy. When you try to identify what's gaining energy and what's losing energy, you shouldn't try to find the electrons in most of the reaction schemes that I'm going to show you. What you should be looking for is oxygen and hydrogen. Here's an example. Let's look at this hydrogen. Let's look at this first. You have a compound called C. I don't care what it is, but it's some organic compound and it has a hydrogen on it. Now, it reacts with this other compound, which I'll just call D. Again, I don't care what its structure actually is, except for this. Notice the hydrogen gets transferred from the C to the D. Now, this is a hydrogen atom, not just one proton. This is the whole hydrogen. So remember, hydrogen contains one proton, one electron. So the electron goes with it. Okay, so which is oxidized and which is reduced? Loss of electron? Well, the C loses the electron on the hydrogen, therefore the C is oxidized. And the D gains the electron on the hydrogen, so therefore the D is reduced. Right? So whenever you see that pattern, whenever you see something losing hydrogen, it's oxidized. Whenever you see something gaining hydrogen, it's reduced. Okay, oxygen is the opposite. Now this is a little bit trickier, but you can think of the electrons as going opposite oxygen. For example, here I have a compound A, and here I have a compound B. B has an oxygen on it, and in the reaction, the oxygen is transferred from the B to the A. In this case, you can think of it this way, but this isn't really quite accurate. You can think of the electrons kind of going in the opposite direction. Really what's happening is you're losing the energy of the electrons because the oxygen has a very high electronegativity, and so it pulls the electrons down tightly. But the way to think about it again is like the electrons going opposite it. So in this case, being oxidized is gain of oxygen. That's where the word actually came from originally. And being reduced is loss of oxygen. Okay, seems weird to say reduction is loss of something, but again, reduction is really gaining that energy. So don't think of reduction in terms of something being reduced in that sense. Reduction is gain of energy, gain of electrons. Okay, so in that case then, this is what we're dealing with. In these examples, A and C are both oxidized and B and D are both reduced. Oxidation, gain of oxygen, loss of hydrogen. Reduction, loss of oxygen, gain of hydrogen. All right, so now we put all this together to see what's happening at the bottom of the ocean. And here in this picture, what I've got here is the bottom of the ocean. Here, that line represents the bedrock, the top of the bedrock. This is the ocean column, the water column here. At the bottom, this is a black smoker, which we saw in one of these previous pictures. And then down here, underneath the bottom of the ocean is still ocean, really. It's all rock. It's all bedrock here. But this bedrock is permeated by the water that's under extremely high pressure at the bottom of the ocean. Now, if this has the right kind of configuration or right kind of chemistry, if in particular at the base of this bedrock, close to the mantle, close to the bottom of the bedrock, there's the right kind of basalt, which is a type of igneous rock that has the right chemistry, then we can have an ecosystem like the one I showed you. We can have this sort of ecosystem that we see here. But it's driven by the chemistry of this rock. All right, now in the bottom of the ocean, like I said, there's quite a lot of stuff that is really harsh under high pressure. Here's what you find in the chemistry. Of course, there's water because we're looking at the ocean. There's oxygen too, although this can also occur without oxygen. There's carbon dioxide because there's carbon dioxide in the air, dissolves in the water. In fact, carbon dioxide dissolves very well in water. And so the ocean is full of carbon dioxide. And then there's this, H2S. The H2S is being spewed out of that black smoke. Now, all of this together can be used by the prokaryotes. And the prokaryotes take this chemistry, and what they then do is they go through this reaction. They take all of this and they make this. Okay? So they make H2SO4, and you should recognize that as sulfuric acid. There's the acid. That's where the acid's coming from. It's being produced by the prokaryotes. And then there's this, CH2O with an N. Okay, now remember that. This is something you've seen before, and you should recognize this from now on for the rest of your life. You should recognize this as a carbohydrate. So there's a C carbo water hydrate, and it's repeated some number of times N. For example, glucose, N would be 6. So this would be C6, H2 times 6, or 12, O6. And then it produces energy. The energy is released. Okay, first question. Is this exergonic or endergonic? Right? Well, we just saw this. This is energy being released, therefore this must be exergonic, which means the delta G is negative, which means this is spontaneous. There's no energy source that's required to drive this. Well, there is an energy source here. We got to figure out what that is. But the point is that we're making sugar and sulfuric acid from this H2S, CO2, O2, and H2O. And that is being done by these prokaryotes in the respiration cycle. Okay, so here's a couple things. First of all, we got to make sure that this equation is balanced. Is it balanced? All right, well, we know how to do that. How many hydrogens are on here? There's 2. How many hydrogens here? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, but there's 2 other hydrogens over here. So we got 2, 4, 2, 4. We're good. So hydrogens are balanced. Sulfur, only 1. Only 1. Good. Sulfurs are balanced. Carbon, only 1. Only 1. Carbon is balanced. Okay, oxygen. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 oxygens. Well, here there's 4 plus 1, 5. So this is entirely balanced. This reaction is completely balanced, and we're in good shape here. All right, so what is going on here? What's this doing? Well, what is this sugar? This sugar represents 2 key things to these prokaryotes. First, it represents a chemical form of energy, chemical potential energy, which it can then use to regenerate its ATP. Remember we saw that before. You're burning ATP at a rate of 100 million per second. There's 2 billion per cell. The prokaryotes down here have the same problem. They've got a limited amount of ATP. They're burning it at about the same rate. So they need to regenerate it. That's what the sugar is going to be able to do. They're harvesting energy somewhere. Where's the energy coming from? We don't know yet. But they're harvesting the energy and using it to make sugar, which they then can release that energy to use to make ATP. The other thing that it represents, and this is every bit as important as using it to make ATP, is the body of the animal or the organism itself. This is biomass. This is stuff that it can use to then make its membranes, its proteins, and everything. Yes, this is a sugar, but everything can be made from that sugar. The proteins can be made from it, the amino acids, the nucleic acids, the nucleotides, everything that creature is made out of, including its membranes, can be made ultimately from this sugar, plus other stuff that might be in the water. So this is critical. This is the animal's body and its energy source right here. Okay, so here's the thing. There's no light involved here. So what we've got here is a form of synthesis, but it's not photosynthesis. Okay, a couple of definitions. This is critical to know. When we say synthesis in biology, what we mean is we're taking inorganic carbon and making organic carbon out of it. That's what synthesis is referring to. Okay, what do I mean by inorganic carbon versus organic carbon? Remember, any compound is organic if it has carbon in it, but not carbon dioxide or carbon monoxide. Right? Remember, so those are the definitions. So here, look at this. We have carbon only here on this side of the equation, and it's carbon dioxide, not organic by definition. This carbon over here is on sugar, which is organic. So that's what I mean. There's the synthesis, taking inorganic carbon and making it organic. Okay, so this is synthesis, but it's not photosynthesis. This is using some other energy source. The photo is the energy source for photosynthesis. Now, plants do the same thing. They take carbon dioxide and make sugar out of it, and that's synthesis. But again, it uses light, so we call it photosynthesis. So what is this? Where's the energy? It comes down to oxidation reduction. Here, something is oxidized. Here, something is reduced. What's oxidized? What's reduced? Whatever's oxidized is giving the energy. What's being reduced is absorbing that energy. Okay, now remember, let's go back to this. We know when something loses hydrogen, it's oxidized. When something gains oxygen, it's oxidized. Something gains hydrogen, it's reduced. Something loses oxygen, it's reduced. All right, so can we identify, did anything here gain oxygen? Right, well, look at the sulfur. H2S goes to H2SO4. So there it gained oxygen. Therefore, the sulfur was oxidized, which means the sulfur lost energy. Okay, now the hydrogens didn't change. It's still H2H2. but it gained oxygen. In fact, it gained a lot of oxygen, therefore it lost a lot of energy. So the energy is coming from the H2S. In fact, specifically, it's coming from the sulfur. So that means that whatever it's doing, it's using the energy from the chemistry, from this chemical, in order to drive the synthesis step. Therefore, this is referred to as chemosynthesis, taking inorganic carbon, making organic carbon, using the energy from a chemical reaction, chemosynthesis. All right, so then what's reduced? Well, if we look over here, here's the carbon, and notice it's CO2. Now, if we look at it on this side of the equation, it's only CH2O. So notice it gained hydrogen. The carbon gained hydrogen, which means carbon was reduced. It also lost oxygen, which means it was reduced. So the energy came from the sulfur and ended up on the carbon. There is the energy transfer from sulfur to carbon in this reaction. Now, that therefore is the professional definition of chemosynthesis, using the energy from chemistry to transfer that energy from sulfur to carbon, using the energy from chemistry to make carbon from inorganic to organic. All right? Now I should ask you, what is the professional definition of photosynthesis? Not the AP Biology high school definition. What's the professional definition of photosynthesis? Okay, you know synthesis, organic, inorganic carbon to organic carbon, photo meaning energy from light. So the definition of photosynthesis to a professional is making inorganic carbon into organic carbon using energy from light. Okay, so here's the point. You got now this chemosynthesis step. You're making the organism's body, and you're giving it an energy source. You're harvesting the energy from sulfur, putting it onto organic compound. Here's the problem. Can we keep this ecosystem alive indefinitely? Well, what's driving it? What's keeping the ecosystem alive is this H2S. The H2S is limited. Once you run out of H2S, this whole process must stop. So how long can that last? Well, if you've got the right kind of basalt, it can last indefinitely. And here's why. Once you have this in solution, the sulfuric acid in solution, what makes it an acid? Well, remember, acids are things that give up protons. So this is going to dissociate, just like we've seen in chemistry class. H2S dissociates into 2 protons plus 2 SO4 ions. It's the SO4 ions that I'm interested in. These will eventually get into cold water. Once it's in the cold water, it will sink because cold water is denser than hot water. So it sinks, and it sinks to the bottom of the ocean, and then it continues to sink because remember, it's under pressure. And it'll continue to go into any little tiny cracks in the bedrock. And so it goes into these bedrock locations and continues down until it comes into contact with a hot basalt. And here's where the chemistry of the basalt matters. If that chemistry is such that there's a catalyst that will allow the energy from the heat to be transferred to this sulfur, then the SO4 ion will go back into being H2S. Now, what happened to the sulfur? Was it oxidized or reduced? Okay, well, it lost oxygen and gained hydrogen. Both of those events, losing these 4 oxygens and gaining 2 hydrogens, means that it was reduced, which means it gained energy. The energy it gained came from the heat of the basalt. All right, so now it's in hot water. So where does it go? Well, hot water is less dense than cold water, so it shoots up through this bedrock and eventually goes out through the black smoker. And so really what this system is doing is it's living off the H2S that's being produced by the black smoker. The black smoker is getting it from the basalt, which is getting the sulfur from the sulfuric acid, and this whole thing then becomes a conveyor belt of energy. The sulfur is the conveyor. Sulfur goes down, grabs the energy from the hot basalt, brings it back up, the prokaryotes use it, goes back, down, and so forth, and continues on in that conveyor belt fashion. Okay, but this is energy, and we know that energy is neither conserved, energy is neither produced nor destroyed. It's conserved. So this process is taking energy, which means energy has to be leaving some other system. Where is the energy leaving? Well, it makes sense that the energy would have to be leaving from the hot basalt. So does that mean that this is causing the basalt to cool and therefore the crust of the earth to cool? Absolutely. That's exactly what's happening. It's taking the energy, and so the crust is cooling a little bit, but just a tiny amount. I mean, we're not talking about a huge amount of energy here. It looks great to these prokaryotes, but when you think about the total energy budget of the planet versus the energy budget of just the living things on the planet, there's a lot more energy being transferred by the planet in all kinds of different ways that has nothing to do with the living system than there is with the stuff that does have to do with the living system. So yes, This is cooling off the Earth, but it's not causing the Earth to cool down in any appreciable way. But this is the simplest metabolic system that we know of, or one of the simplest metabolic systems that we know of. So whenever we see a metabolic system like this, look for what's being reduced, look for what's being oxidized. Here, the sulfur is being oxidized, giving up energy. Here, the carbon is being reduced, gaining the energy. Here, the sulfur is being reduced, gaining energy, and the basalt, therefore, must be being oxidized. I'm not showing you that reaction because it's outside the scope of the course. It's an inorganic reaction. But this is the basic conveyor of what's driving the system of living things down there at the bottom of the ocean.